to practice empathy, to do it well and to be effective at it, takes a huge amount of courage and strength, because you have to be able to hold space for challenge and contestation and difference. And that isn't easy. That takes a very strong leader to be able to put aside their own ego, their own interest, their own need to be right, and say there is something greater beyond all of us if we can work together.
All right, everyone. So I am very excited to welcome to the podcast today Professor Claire Yorke. She is the author of the new book, Empathy in Politics and Leadership. And as any of you know who have listened to council programming, who are following values and interests, we think a lot about kind of the personal values equation, the virtues that people need to kind of focus on, especially within their public and their private lives. And so I think we have an expert today on empathy. Empathy is also kind of trending, or a lack thereof of empathy has been trending in the news lately in the political world. So we're going to dig into that with Claire. So Claire, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Great. So, listeners by now will feel kind of tired of me teeing it up this way, but I still hope it's useful. What we like to do on the Values Interest podcast to begin is really kind of dig into the value system of our own guests. I am a big believer, and I think some of the empirical evidence bears this out as well, that, there aren't just institutions in the world. There aren't these monolithic states. There aren't these one companies, right? They are made up by people who have individual value systems. And if we don't look at those systems, we are definitely leaving a door closed on understanding how these things work. So maybe we can start there, Claire, in terms of like your formation around values, and then we can kind of pick it up and get into your professional side as well.
Yeah, I love that question. And it does provoke a lot of thinking on what are the most important things in our lives and how have we got there. And so I've been reflecting on this in advance of the podcast. And for me, as I've been studying international relations for over 20 years now, and I've always been struck by how in that discipline there's a real focus on power and interest and security. And they're really important factors. But I
Yeah.
always found that didn't align with my experience growing up. To take it back
Mm,
to that family, I found I was surrounded by family and friends who were very much about community, who were very much about generosity and kindness. My grandparents were doing charity work until they were well in their 90s. My grandma, I once went and helped her at an old people's home where she was older than a lot of the people that she was helping. So this idea of charity and kindness and community was something that I saw a lot growing up. And so it's given me maybe a bit of an optimistic view of human nature and a real belief in the importance of kindness and compassion and understanding. And alongside that, growing up in the northwest of the United Kingdom, my family always emphasized the importance of equality. And as I've grown older, that's also transitioned more into a belief in equity, that
mm,
actually we should all have equal opportunities, and we should create systems and structures where people have what they need to exist and at a very basic level, but also to thrive and to prosper in ways that are far more meaningful than just the material dimensions.
mm.
And and that's really informed my approach to politics and to life. And empathy connects with that idea of equity, because we all need different things in some ways. And so how do
Yeah.
we understand what different people need?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sure we'll pull on this thread a little bit more,
mm,
kind of the international relations framing that you gave at the beginning. The big question we always ask, right? Where we at the council think of this ethical realism concept, where yes, it is about power, and we understand that actors are going to attempt to maximize their role in the world, protect their national interests. But for open societies, for liberal democracies, the big outstanding question is power. Yes, power is a given, but power to what end? Power can take many different forms, right? It can take a more moralistic, a less responsible, a more amoral, a more idealistic. So maybe if I could kind of get a reaction to maybe the nuances within power and how you think about that. And I think this will provide a good bedrock for kind of going into other areas of the book.
yeah, and that's one of the big themes of the book, is this idea that we talk a lot about power, and it's often in the context of power over. And a lot of the discussions we have right now around strongman leaders, about more populist politics, is about ideas of and concerns around domination in political spaces, the idea that there's one vision of how things can be done. And so the book and my own thinking is very much about how do we move to systems of power with where we're co-creating solutions, where we
Mm,
get more people to be invested in creating power, and where also we are empowering people to have more agency as citizens so that people feel like they have more choice and opportunity to act and respond and to shape their political reality, their social reality.
yeah,
And I think power has these different forms, and how as well do we embrace forms of resistance, forms
yeah,
of contests of power to understand how power itself might be refined and better serve
yeah.
more people?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing from a US perspective right now is this caricature of power where it's masculine, it's transactional, right? And I think you bring up a very good point. There is not a one definition of power. This is kind of conceptually driven in many ways, and just what you attach to it.
Mhm.
This goes to a lot of kind of the work that I'm doing around kind of narratives and their impact on geopolitics right now. But it's an interesting there's the literal use of power in kind of the arena of geopolitics, and then there's the battle over what power is and how it's conceived at the same time. And these things I found are happening in parallel, and it's a very distressing time, especially for people who are kind of, I would say aligned with kind of pluralistic visions of the world. But from an international relations perspective, it's also a very interesting time to be studying this area. And I'm sure you found that in kind of going into this study and this writing of the book on empathy.
Yeah, and it is fascinating, and it connects with what you said there about narratives as well. How do we tell different stories about what power is and what it can do? Because there's a danger we get into these very narrow loops about what power is and how it serves us. And
Mm,
that lacks imagination in the political space, I
yeah,
think. And it also limits the longer term implications and impact of what is possible with politics.
yeah,
Um, and I work as well in the space of strategy and strategic thinking, and I think often our horizons of impact are too short. And so, how do we tell different stories about power that has a far longer implication? And what do you then start to consider? What are the questions you need to be asking in order to have power sustained in a healthier way over the
mm,
longer term?
yeah. No, I think it goes back to this rising tide lifts all boats versus zero sum. In order for me to gain power, you have to lose power. And the latter that's a concept, right, that has been attached to realism. But it seems like from an empathy perspective, right, that doesn't need to happen. Right. There can be this rising tide lifts all boats, empowering versus power taking approach. And um, that's what kind of I was trying to read between the lines of the book, and kind of the things that really spoke to me is that there's a nuance there. It's just taking the time to get into that nuance and understand it and then wield it maybe politically to give an alternative.
Exactly. And how do we, I think it's about taking more people with us, because I'm also worried that when you have a system of power over,
Mm,
it's very easy for citizens to get complacent or apathetic. What is the point of them acting? What is the point of them getting involved in politics if they have no way of shaping it? So it's about how do we move to new systems that actually says we can all be invested in this change, and we actually all have to in our
yeah,
everyday change behaviors, show up in different ways, have opinions, have ideas, make changes to our lives that will
yeah,
have implications longer term.
yeah. I've been having a lot of conversations on the podcast in relation to, again, the challenges that our democracies are facing right now, and this debate over where there's this nihilism that's happening. And you're alluding to it a bit, but in my experience in these conversations, nihilism almost feels like a cop out. Right, it's too much of an easy prescription around kind of citizenry, or kind of othering a group as lazy or disinterested. And maybe I could pull on that thread a little bit, because I felt like that maybe there was something there around that nuance.
Yeah, and that is something the book talks about, because when I started the book, it was very much about leadership and leaders that we'd seen during the pandemic who had stepped up and shown empathy. And it was intended to be a book about how leaders who are empathetic can transform our systems. And I talk about this in the preface. But the more I started observing it, I thought, well, this lets us off the hook. If all we're doing is waiting for a leader to be empathetic, to show us the kind of way of doing things differently and giving us a vision, it denies us as citizens and voters of responsibility. It means we just wait passively for it to get better. But
Yep.
actually, we're the people who are voting in politicians who are making these changes that are proving very harmful to society, who
Yep.
are undermining the fabric of what we think society should be and what we think our politics could do. So we need to be taking a bit more ownership over this and
Yep.
just assuming that it's out of our control and that that's just the way politics works. Feels like a cop out, like you say.
Yeah. So we're going to swing back to it, but I don't want to get too far ahead because I think the listeners will get annoyed. I'd like to take a step back and maybe pause and just go back to the core concept of the book, which is empathy. And maybe for our listeners, because again, this is a concept that gets personalized in people's lives, right? Like you feel empathy, you act with empathy, but maybe from an academic perspective, how do you think about, how do you define empathy, and how did that provide a framework for the book at large?
Yeah, so there are different definitions of empathy. I define it as an attempt to understand the experiences, perspectives, interests, and the context of other people. So often empathy gets divided into cognitive and affective, which is emotional, the way you innately feel understanding or you feel a strong connection to someone. But I actually argue that it's a mixture of both. That even if you are taking a more conscious and deliberate cognitive approach to someone else's experience and what they're going through, you also need to factor in how they're feeling about that and how those feelings shape the ways in which they interpret their circumstances, their environment, and the options and choices available to them. And integral to empathy as a definition is also, I think, self-reflection and the ability to consider what we bring to that dynamic. It is a relational construct. It's something that is between two people, between multiple people. And so we have to know what is it that we bring? How have our words and behaviors and our actions shaped the experiences or the histories of others? And especially in the realm I deal with, which is often diplomacy and statecraft, how do people who represent a state or a large organization, like a diplomat or a military officer, represent more than just themselves?
Yeah.
So if you show up as an American civil servant, as an American diplomat, you might have a very good professional relationship with someone else. You may connect well with someone very easily and very effectively in another country, but you also have to be conscious of how your own country and what you represent is going to be understood and interpreted. So it has that interpretive dimension. And for me, part of it is also about getting people more comfortable talking about emotions because empathy offers that lens into the emotional landscapes of people. And so often we want to imagine that rationality is neat and sterile and emotions are, you know, unquantifiable and messy. But actually, we're humans. They're absolutely
Yeah.
intrinsic to how we relate to other people and connect with them and engage with our environments.
Yep. And people are not the the perfect stoic model 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I would say that is probably the opposite of that most of the time. So again, blind spot if we don't seriously understand the emotional side and what drives people. Super interesting. There's so many directions I want to go in off of this. Um, the first one is thinking about this again in the realm of maybe diplomacy. And we're kind of seeing this bifurcation right now when it comes to, again, transactional diplomacy, kind of corruption bubbling up from where maybe it used to be hidden, and deal making, and kind of a rejection of multilateral systems, reciprocity, these kind of things that have underpinned, albeit with many difficulties over the past 80 years. What does a future in kind of the diplomatic environment look like where empathy is shelved and maybe even worse thought of as a weakness? What does that look like? How does that end, if well at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased. I don't think that ends well. I think it ends with this very much deal-making diplomacy. And diplomacy is about relationships and it's about building those lines of communication, building relations of trust and credibility, building the ability to engage with others um, in spaces where you can be frank and honest and you can negotiate what's really going on under the surface. And my fear is that it becomes transactional and very short-termist, that you lose the kind of long-term bonds of trust and the relations that can sustain it, that people will renege on deals when it no longer serves them, and that people will start to see it as um, where people stop valuing um, the kind of bilateral and multilateral agreements that they've entered into and the norms by which diplomacy is conducted. A lot of the norms of diplomacy are about just respecting the office of the diplomat, respecting what they represent, um, communication, dialogue, negotiation, being able to listen and understand to diverse perspectives and to find ways through conflict.
Yeah,
And if it just becomes about achieving a deal, signing that treaty without all of the substance and the relations that go behind it, I think you end
yeah,
up with much weaker diplomacy and
yeah,
much weaker relations with states, which makes
yeah,
it harder to then achieve common and collective responses to shared problems like climate
yeah,
change, like
yeah.
environmental degradation, AI, um, weapon proliferation, organized crime.
Yeah, no, it's the the transactionalism is certainly concerning to us from the Carnegie Council perspective, from an individual action all the way up to this kind of infusion of that ethos into a diplomatic corps. And so, it's interesting. I was talking recently with a group of the council about kind of drawing a straight line from the norms that were violated kind of post 9/11 from a US perspective around torture and kind of being able to draw a straight line from that to kind of the normative erosion, the permission structure, the domino effect. Like this doesn't always happen tomorrow or a year or 2 years down, but these decisions to be corrupt or to be openly transactional or to put the UN aside, these have massive impacts. Maybe not today, but down the line. And I was speaking with the president or the executive director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, and he was talking about kind of the the building of this international civil society, civil servants that for the first time really in history were asked to put a international community at least on par with their national interests, and that was a real rewiring of the diplomat. It'll be interesting to see kind of what the rewiring is required. Maybe empathy is one of the cures for that when we have to tackle this in today or tomorrow or in a few years from now. So just interesting point that he flagged, and that being a flashpoint for diplomacy and really kind of not only putting national interests as the number one thing to think about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem is that the transactional approach can be very effective in the short term. You know,
Yes.
you can get some real quick wins that look like you're doing it differently, but there's a reason diplomacy's been done this way for thousands of years. And it's exactly like you say, the norms, the moment you start eroding common norms that people have invested in about how we treat each other and how we treat citizens of states and those international binding agreements that have enabled a certain level of peace and security for the most part. Yeah, it just becomes far more anarchical than we can manage.
Yeah, no, it's it's a very trying moment. But what I want to do for the listeners is I think we've talked about the concept of empathy, we've talked about power, we've talked about maybe the influence on the diplomatic or international relations level. So I want to go down to examples. So this is always like a discipline I have to always say this to myself in the mirror working at Carnegie Council. It's like don't stay in the abstract, right? Get down to the human level, to the policy examples. So maybe we can talk through some of these moral leaders, these empathetic leaders that have really um, embraced empathy, but did it in a way that was also responsible from a realist perspective. Who are those people that you think about that were able to get things done politically to advance their nation or their community's interests while still using or embracing empathy?
Yeah, there are a number of examples. I guess one of the very prominent ones, especially connected to that realist lens, is President Nelson Mandela of South Africa, who really centered this idea of understanding others and bridging divides as part of the way that he sought to reunite South Africa after apartheid, after a very painful history for the country. And he was not immune to the challenges of that. And there was a sense of interest in trying to maintain a coherent state, trying to realize the state's interests, but bringing different people on board, making sure that he put that into practice in who he selected, in how he reflected on including the Afrikaners and including all of the South Africans in the reconstruction of a country, and then also in the repair and justice as part of healing that country, which I think is a real example of empathy. Another one that obviously is invoked a lot is New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who has put that very much as the center of her ethos in politics. She's been very open about how she considers empathy key to transforming society and politics. She did so very early in her career, and I think that was a really interesting example of what that looks like. She had a well-being budget in New Zealand. She made a real effort after the Christchurch terrorist attacks in 2019 of bridging the divides within the society, making sure that the Muslim population who had been targeted by the attacker did not feel marginalized or left behind, that she created that sense of community and a more vibrant New Zealand where everybody was a part of the country and the response. But she also matched that with very rapid action on gun control and on countering online violent extremism. So kind of showing that more pragmatic side. It can't just be nice words and kind messages. It actually has to be met by something tangible that people can see.
This goes to one of kind of the key not problems, but issues to be solved when it comes to morality and amoral actors, right? So we think about applied ethics here at the council. And if you were going to engage in ethics, if you're going to engage with somebody else's value system who you may disagree with, when you come through the doors here, there is an understanding of you are going to engage in good faith, right? Even if your value system is different, even if your beliefs are different, etc. But not everybody engages in good faith. And I
Mhm.
think especially in now where you see these challenges at a systemic level to pluralism, whether it's from tech actors or this transition from a liberal to a liberal democracies or kind of the autocratic actors of the world, just throwing out some examples. What's the approach to empathy for somebody who has these political responsibilities and may be engaging on a daily basis with people who are not going to engage in good faith, and don't share kind of the basic universal moral worth perspective of individuals? And kind of how do you think about that? How do you think about navigating that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's very important to be clear-eyed in the political space about the fact that we can't afford to just be blindly idealist about the potential of concepts like empathy or kindness or compassion. And you're right, there will be people who will look to exploit that as a weakness or who will just have no interest in it as a way of achieving their interests. And I think there's a need to differentiate between empathy in its ideal form, where you're trying to create a system that is inclusive and equitable and kind, and empathy that can also be more strategic
Yeah.
about understanding, well, what are they trying to get at? Where are they coming from? Um, and being very conscious of how people might misuse and abuse power or position or authority um, in a way that will undermine your more common goals. So using it as a way to still understand it, but recognizing that empathy has a hard edge. And I think it's important to note that empathy can have boundaries. Often it's seen as a weakness, as something that will just lead to appeasement and just rolling over and letting people do whatever. And actually, empathy to be effective should have boundaries. You should be able to articulate that you are willing to understand where people are coming from, but there's certain standards, there's certain limits to what you will tolerate, to what is acceptable. And that's then about the norms of good behavior within governments, about the standards in this instance of politics. What do we expect as a basic standard for effective, healthy democracy? And how do we make sure that we can then hold those to account who are not living up to that?
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is that often those mechanisms at the moment that would call people to account are being eroded or are not being used properly.
Yeah.
So people are getting away with far more than maybe they would have 20 years ago. Uh, and so empathy can have boundaries, and we also have to be very conscious that it can be performative, that some people can use it as a way of signaling virtue where maybe they do not have it. And
Mm.
that makes it difficult then, because how do you know who has it and who doesn't? Especially if that's something that might be subjective, that
Yeah.
I will view the people I agree with in politics as having it, but
Yeah.
those I disagree with as lacking it. And it's
Yeah.
never that simple or black and white. But there will be certain people who use the language of performative virtue, performative empathy, to ingratiate themselves with people in power when actually that's not their intention. And
Yeah.
so that's where you start looking at other qualities. Are their words and their actions aligning? Are they
Yeah.
doing what they say they'll do? When they
Yeah.
talk about inclusivity, are they really practicing it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think from, the Mandela example, right, he is faced with what m many people would have used a hard power, solution to address, right? And he went the other direction. So I think this goes back to how we think about power as a concept and empathy as a prescription to open up potentially unseen pathways, right? The goal is to get people reconciled and back into a system, right? At the end of the day, a new system, but back into a type of system. It can't be a free for all. So it's very interesting to think about kind of empathy as a tool to deal with very difficult political situations, even violent political situations, but not a tool that maybe people would think to reach for immediately.
Yeah. And there's also, we underestimate the power of empathy to be something quite strong. And that's what I'm interested in, that we often dismiss it because it is associated with emotions, it's associated with kindness or compassion.
Yeah,
Um, and that can make people feel like it doesn't have a place within our politics. But actually, to practice empathy, to do it well and to be effective at it, takes a huge amount of courage and strength, because you have to be able to hold space for challenge and contestation and difference. And
yes,
that isn't easy. That takes a very strong leader to be
yes,
able to put aside their own ego, their own interest, their own need to be right, and say there is something greater beyond all of us if we can work together.
yeah.
And that is far harder than just plowing ahead with your very narrow interests.
Yeah, no, it's also interesting from a leadership perspective. Again, we're thinking about this a lot at the council. What is the job description of a leader, right? A job description for a leader is to understand that this isn't just an exercise to ingratiate yourself or to make money, right? Like the job description is to take the hits, right? To
Mhm.
be willing to do that.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting moment right now. I think we are seeing civil society, private sector, higher ed tested right now, especially from a US perspective in the US. And while there are not many, you are really starting to see the leaders who understand the job description start to separate themselves out. And there's some great people I've been seeing lately. But yeah, it's a it's a very interesting moment to be practicing empathy, but in a non-performative moral mask virtue signaling way. And that goes back to kind of the framework in applied ethics that we think about is the ends and means equation, really kind of being able to understand that not just from a transactional power perspective, but from a individual ethical moral compass perspective as well.
Exactly. And that's the hard work.
Yeah, no, it's the really difficult work. So one of the things I loved about the book was that in the closing chapters, you really kind of lay out an approach for empathy in practice. In at the council, again, we think about this as your values informing your principles, right? Principles are actions, and principles can be informed by things such as values and your morals, or they can be absent of those. So maybe you can kind of walk our listeners through kind of your playbook around how to actionalize empathy. I think this is what people want to hear. They want to hear the step process. What should we be thinking about? What should we be prioritizing in our own lives?
Yeah, and in the final chapter where I do that, I look at it in different levels because again, going back to this idea which is central to the book that empathy is should exist in an ecosystem. It's not enough to expect our leaders to be the ones to make the change. So
Yep.
in this action chapter where I set out the steps, it's divided into the national level, the community level, and the individual level.
Yep.
And so at the national level, it's very much about how do we start to create the political systems and structures where we can allow empathy to thrive. So it's about bridging that gap between politicians and the people, encouraging there to be more participatory democracy, for people to be able to engage with their politicians on a more regular basis, and for politicians to start listening far more to what citizens are saying, either through citizens' assemblies, through other forms of participatory democracy. Um, I think it's also important to see more bipartisanship, that actually on certain common issues, whether that's healthcare or the environment or education, we see people on different sides of the aisle or different sides of the chamber, depending on the political system that your country has, reaching across and finding common approaches to the challenges. Because at the moment, we seem to be very much locked in countries like America and the United Kingdom, where I'm from, in much more adversarial politics where neither side really wants to give way to the other. We need more of that bipartisanship. Um, at a more community level, it's also about creating more civic spaces for people. So, how do we create environments where people can start to encounter difference on a more regular basis? And there's
Mm.
some really good organizations, especially in America, who are doing this. People like Bridge USA, Braver Angels, More in Common, who are starting to create environments where you can get people who vote differently, who think very differently about issues,
Yep.
just connecting with each other and having conversations and seeing the other side as human.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline, I think, a point of nuance, which is very important. So I've always thought about empathy as that, right? As core is the willingness to engage with difference and
Mhm.
try to experience how somebody else lives,
Mhm.
how their values are set, etc. There is this kind of dark narrative that is being pushed right now that in order to experience someone else, they have to come in and change what you love or what your country was in its heyday. And so I think there's this nuance there. So it's almost this cycle where I
Mhm.
can't be empathetic because that will require me to sacrifice something that I care about and I love, and people kind of go back into their corners. We're seeing this in the American experience, just the other day with President Trump's comments about the Somali citizens in the U.S. or recent migrants. It's this fear factor in relation to even like giving empathy a chance. And so I just wanted to underline that because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Yeah. And do you think that more exposure to different perspectives in these kind of spaces will help, or are you finding that people are reluctant to engage at
I
all?
That is central to my value system. I've had some moments in my life where I was in a situation that you could never understand unless you experienced it, right? So like my wife is from India. The first time I went and visited her family, went for a few weeks and basically this is 15 years ago in a city in South India, and there was nobody like me like that around, and I was like, oh, this is what my wife felt like at college, where like I could always be like, oh, I understand, I love you, yeah, blah blah blah, but like I could never, and I barely understood even after that experience. But there's just this light that kind of goes off in your head where it's like, oh, right. It's the same way. Like, I took a job before previously where I went and worked in the private sector for a lot more money, and I was miserable. And anybody can tell you, oh, well, it's not actually worth the money. You have to trip and fall and make that mistake yourself. Because any time somebody says that, you're just going to roll their eyes. So, like,
Mhm.
there can be economic experience, personal experience, family experience. Um, but I would say from my own values perspective, that has been very formative, the experience and the empathy that came with that experience. And I think that goes to kind of, again, at a higher level, my own value system of just really prioritizing pluralism, universality and then kind of starting from there, and then we can figure out the political stuff. But a lot of the
Yeah.
times that just nobody wants to get, not that I'm special, I am, nobody wants to climb the rung up to the universality and start, right? And at least empathy through experience for me has been a very powerful thing in my life.
Yeah, that's a great example. And it also speaks to maybe one of those steps that we have to do is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I
Yes.
think it's very easy in today's environment where we can stay in our echo chambers and bubbles on social media to feel like we are always right and that we have the upper hand and the moral cause. And actually, empathy involves you being comfortable being uncomfortable. You've got to be able to make that space and that time. And you must have had to confront some of your own assumptions or some of your own sense of privilege or experience in order to then come to the kind of conclusions you did. And so that requires us to self-reflect. And so, as citizens, we have to get better at being uncomfortable and recognizing there are experiences beyond our own awareness. Doesn't make them any less valid. There are people who have gone through things that we can't imagine. That doesn't make them wrong, but it should encourage us to be curious. And that's a step we should take rather than judging immediately. How do we get curious? How do we lean in? Ask more questions, find out what the hinterland is to people's own
Yeah.
perspectives and interests.
Yeah, I also think there's, again, from a narrative perspective, from an informational ecosystem environment perspective, people attach risk to being maybe not perfectly right about something.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's an experience, right, that is attached to every individual person, right? Like there are some empirical things that are very important that we agree on and get
Yeah.
right because these can, poison the water or give you bad medicine, right? Like there's all these things. Like we have to agree on the traffic light colors, right? There's all these things. But there are other things that don't really matter, right? Like when it more opinion based. And it's okay if you don't agree with somebody on that, right? Like it's not going to end, it doesn't need to ruin your day. It's not going to end your world, right? But now everything is just personally politicized, zero sum, and I don't really see the trend changing on that right now, but it almost it almost sucks the air out of the room for like the ability to experience empathy, right? All these ecosystems are being made almost anti-empathetically, right? It's not meant to thrive. So I don't know, it's very difficult to find spaces, like you said, find civic spaces to really experience it in a good faith way.
Yeah. And also to just get better at acknowledging when we've got it wrong.
Yeah.
And there's a humility that comes with that. And we don't see it very often in our politicians, but we should. And I think that's a real important value as well, that we see politicians able to say, I got this wrong, I made a mistake, and that we are able to do it in our everyday life, that we
Yeah.
step back a bit. And especially at the time when we're talking, I know you've just had Thanksgiving over there,
Yeah.
Christmas, the holiday season is coming up, where a lot of people will be worried about the dinner table discussions, but it's
Yes.
okay if you just don't agree and you change the topic.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I know there's more nuance to that. I know that there's some issues that are very much that deny someone the right to their own dignity, and that's an issue. That's something that requires more work. But actually, for a lot of the more moderate things, we have to get better at engaging.
Yeah. Well, it also starts, I think two things can be true at once. As you said, there are kind of high consequence nuance things where you can't just kind of like let it go.
Yeah.
Right. But like I have found in stressful family situations and around these dinner tables, like this is the moment in almost more of a low stakes way to kind of train your temperance, to train your virtues, right, that you want to get better at, to count to 10 in the most
Yeah.
basic way to say it. And that actually, like, family is a trial by fire in that way. And you can take that into the workplace. This can be
Yeah.
your gym, right? You can work that out from an ethical perspective. You can work the moral muscle there, especially around some of these virtues. That we try to cultivate that are related to empathy. So yeah, no, it's I fully agree with you on that, and it's it's been top of mind. We just got through Thanksgiving, now we have to get through Christmas.
Yeah, use it as a time to practice empathy. See how you feel by the new year,
Exactly,
whether it feels a little bit easier.
exactly. I love that. Oh my gosh, I hope my family's listening to this so they know my approach in the coming weeks. Good. So I wanted to go back on a more serious note to there were multiple times during our conversations where I wanted to interject, but I waited on
Mhm.
this.
Okay.
Um, Around this tension that I see in terms of the moment that we're in politically and the prescription that we've talked a lot about with empathy, in that it needs to be not only top down from a leader perspective, but it really needs to be grassroots and bottom up if we're going to kind of break some of the shackles of politicization and zero sum polarized world. I guess the big question is that for a lot of democracies around the world, it feels like a moment where it's kind of on a razor's edge. And there is this tension in that you need strong moral leaders, at least as part of the solution, right? And we've seen the consequences of these immoral strong leaders, right? So, how do you kind of square the circle and kind of cultivating, thinking about empathy within strong leaders without kind of succumbing to the strong leader model, even if it starts from a moral perspective?
Yeah, and that to me really gets to this idea of the ecosystem, that what
Yeah.
you need is that multi-pronged approach, really, where we start calling for more of the moral leadership, that we start making those choices at the ballot box, that we start holding more people to account in the media, in society, that we start shifting what it is we value as a leadership quality at the top. But that at the same time, we start to ask very real questions around, well, what is the nature of our political system itself? Is it letting those people get to the top? How do we think about that? There's some really good work being done by organizations like Compassion in Politics and Better Politics about how do we make it so that politics is not a toxic work environment, so that you don't get politicians who are burnt out and whose capacity to care has been kind of pushed to breaking point.
Yeah.
So how do we change that political culture, encourage more collegiality, more bipartisanship, more consideration of care, but then also at the same time, how do we start modeling it at the bottom so
Yeah.
that some politicians are like, oh, this way of doing business that is the strong amoral leadership is just not going to fly anymore because that's not what people want. And where you start to see the impact of that. Um, and the challenge is it's dependent on so many different um, spaces being invested in that change.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's enough to wait for a strong moral leader to come through. We have to help create the conditions where
Yeah.
they will be rewarded and where it's possible. But we have to show that it will survive without them as well. And
Yeah.
I think there's actually a lot of hope and comfort to be derived when you start to look at what's going on in the citizen and the civic space. And in America, you've got some amazing initiatives in places like Oregon and California where participatory democracy is really making some positive strides to create change.
Yeah.
Uh, I think you've got a lot of organizations that are showing there's different ways of doing things, but we have to start telling that story more publicly, letting people
Mm.
know about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the big opportunities right now, and I'm in my late 30s, and I've had this kind of moment recently, after my wife and I started a family, where your friend circle starts to close, right? And then you start to kind of crave that connection again, right? Like you're busy with work and you're busy with kids, and you used to have all these friends in your 20s and you're going out, and now it just kind of closes, right? And the point I'm making is that I, especially in this head down on my phone, scrolling even next to my spouse environment. I think this goes across any age group, right? There's an opportunity, like people are, they're craving civic space, they're craving
Yeah.
individuals, right? Like you still get that from sports and concerts to an extent, but like these are just, the spaces are disappearing, right? And so I think there is a really interesting kind of amazing opportunity within the structure of pluralism to find new innovative ways to create these experiences for people. And like that's as good of a dopamine hit as you're ever going to get on Instagram, right? It's just you have to figure out to incentivize and to really showcase how that can be possible for people.
Yeah, and again, you kind of have to get uncomfortable and you have to put in effort, right? You got to
Yeah.
go put on shoes, go meet people you don't know,
Yeah.
start going through the small talk of who are you, where are you from, what do you do?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just a few years ago, your former Surgeon General released a report about loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness, especially in America, and quite
Yeah.
how that can have corrosive implications for health and well-being, how that is responsible for increased anxiety, for depression,
Yeah.
mental discomfort, and ill health. And I think there's something in that. We are wired for connection and we've forgotten that. And I think there's still a lot of seeds and evidence that there's an appetite for that and that it is thriving in certain spaces, but we need to make it far more the norm. We need to make it more mainstream.
Yeah.
And um, I think that will help make it easier for people to connect with others and start
Yeah.
to um, build that empathy back into how we relate to others.
I can't recommend this book enough to everybody who's listening. I think specifically because there is, as we talked about, so much in it from a personal perspective. There's multi levels, the personal perspective and the political perspective. So those working in politics, those working in higher education, I think you're going to get something out of this personally, and your day job will be better. And then people who are looking just from an individual perspective, I think you'll get a lot out of it because everybody's involved, at least from again phone in their hands perspective in politics right now. Um, so I wanted to close, Claire, in terms of anything that we might not have hit on from an empathy perspective, and maybe kind of give the floor to you. And I think a lot of times, not to be overly prescriptive, but a lot of times I like to give the listener something they can kind of like take home with them and maybe take an action.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. Yes, there's a couple of things I would just emphasize that reflect back on themes from our conversation. One is that I think this idea of pragmatic idealism is a helpful way through right now, that we hold as citizens, as a collective, an ideal of what we want our politics to be, but we also embrace the messy, hard work that it will take us to get there, that it's not that simple, that we do all need to show up and we need to start having the difficult conversations with people who disagree with us about what change can look like and what it will take.
Yeah.
I think there's also a really important message about hope and the power of hope in politics, that there is still this hope and that gives us energy and it gives us motivation, but it has to be matched by courage. If we hope for something better, if we imagine that this is not who we are or what we are capable of, but there's far more beyond that, we have to have the courage to work for that and maintain that sense of hope. But connected with that, we also need to start having better stories, telling better stories about who we are, about what we're about what it is that makes us human, what it is that makes us thrive as communities, and about how we start to translate that into very real, practical, inclusive politics that everyone can be a part of, that we can't leave people behind. We can't solve this current moment by excluding more people from the next iteration of politics. So we need those strong visionary leaders, but we also need people who can take everyone with them. And that isn't just the work of any one person, that's the work of all of us.
Yes. No, and I just want to underline that this is a theme that's been cutting through all of my conversations is okay, it's a time for courage. It's a time to embrace a values-based approach to civic life. Okay, but I don't want to do that by myself, right? So I
Mhm.
think find your community, find your values, your values linked community because it's hard being alone on the values island, right? But if
Yeah.
we can find a community together, then this helps drive our personal courage, our personal energy, and obviously has a domino effect from a community perspective. So I will underline that again. This is as everybody's Carnegie Council knows, this is a theme that's been popping up. So thank you for underlining it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Good. Well, Claire, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.